Well, welcome everyone. There is dessert in the back. Make sure you pick up some dessert. We've got regular coffee, decaf coffee, tea. Please eat and enjoy yourselves. We'll begin in a little bit, probably about 5-10 minutes.
Is it? Good evening, everyone. As you finish your dessert, if you could make your way up here to the chairs, we're going to get started in just a few minutes, please. All right, everybody. Well, welcome to tonight's learning community event focused on political polarization. But as we begin, let's remember why this issue matters to us as Christian people. So, to give us some context, let's go back in time to the mid to late 50s, by which I mean the actual 50s, not the 1950s, but the 50s, when St. Paul wrote a letter to the Christians in Rome. His letter is filled with really important ideas about the content of the Christian faith. Included in that letter, in the opening verses of chapter 12, are these words: "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." In other words, Paul was reminding his readers that we should not limit our ideas, our imaginations, our thoughts about what is possible to what the world tells us. Instead, we should open our minds and stretch our visions so that they match God, so that they reflect God's intentions for the world, for our communities, and for our lives. This doesn't mean that we don't take life on this planet seriously. In fact, the opposite is actually true. We take it very seriously, shaping and reshaping, imagining and reimagining until life in this creation reflects God and God's way. To do this work, we need to understand ourselves and our world as completely and as accurately as we can. Only if we take the world and its challenges seriously can we strive to reshape them according to God's will. So tonight, Andy is going to pose two questions. Number one, why are American legislatures so polarized? And number two, what policies might help to bridge the growing ideological gap? But two things before we get started. Number one, this will be a nonpartisan conversation. That's important because we are a church. Our job is not to line up with any political power or party. Our job is to understand the political landscape, ask good questions, and bring to the conversation our goals and values as Christian people. Second, the research that you are going to hear about tonight is also nonpartisan. If it weren't, the research and its findings would be compromised, and it wouldn't help us to gain an accurate perspective of our world. So, our presenter tonight is a PhD candidate at Stanford University in political economics. He is ABD, which stands for all but dissertation, and in other words, he's getting close to the end of the program. For those of us in the First Congregational Church family, he is also living proof that little boys who are rambunctious in worship and Sunday school really do grow up.
Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It looks like I have brought some of the bad weather, and while I'm here from California, the weather is somewhat crazy. So I'm excited to share with you today a series of work in my dissertation and some other ongoing work about polarization in American legislatures. I'm going to share 4 different papers that I've been working on, and I hope that you get 2 things out of this presentation today. One, I want to help you answer this question: why are American legislatures so polarized? Why does this matter? And what can we do about it? And second, I want to give you a sense of the really careful work that I and my co-authors and other political scientists are doing to help us answer these questions. And that it's important when you're consuming this research and thinking about politics and polarization to realize that the answer is not always what is on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's not what is in the opinion section that is always right. These issues are difficult, and it's important to think carefully about them and how we answer them. So let's jump in. One of the most persistent and puzzling trends in American politics over the last 50 years is the polarization of American legislatures. Today, more than ever, Democrats vote with Democrats, and Republicans vote with Republicans. And this is something that concerns everyday voters like ourselves. A poll by 538 in 2022 reported that 3 in 10 Americans named political polarization as one of the top 3 issues facing the country. The only things above it were jobs and immigration. And 4 in 10 voters reported this was their greatest concern. And a poll back in 2017 reported that half of Americans said that political polarization is extremely threatening to the United States. And it's not just voters that are worried about polarization. All the way back in 2012, Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein wrote this book called It's Worse Than It Looks. And their famous quote from this book, a New York Times bestseller, is that partisan polarization is undeniably the central and most problematic feature of contemporary American politics. Levitsky and Zablot put it a little bit more bluntly: polarization can destroy democracy. So why is it that scholars and the public are so worried about polarization? I'm going to walk you through 3 explanations in the literature about why we're concerned about polarization and why we might want to reduce it. The first is probably no surprise to any of us in this room. When American legislatures are polarized, it becomes harder for parties to compromise and to pass policy. We've seen this play out in the last couple of months with the shutdown of the federal government. Because, at least partially because the parties are so far apart ideologically, the federal government was shut down for 42 days. So there's this concern that when polarization increases, American legislatures are less able to respond to the concerns and to the problems of the day. A second concern about polarization is that it leads to poor representation. That is, the people that represent you are not representing the positions that you espouse and you want them to espouse. And that as a result of all of this, a third concern is that the public's confidence in governing institutions may decline. I just looked at a recent poll this morning, and the public's approval of Congress sits at about 9% now. And it's hard to imagine that this is not partially due to the polarization that we see in Congress today. So these are 3 reasons that we might be concerned about polarization in American legislatures. But polarization is not necessarily unhealthy for an American democracy. And to see why that's the case, we can actually look back to 1950. In 1950, the American Political Science Association, a group of the most preeminent political science scholars in America, wrote this 150-page article or book called Towards a More Responsible Two-Party System. And in this book, they called for a responsible party government in which the parties explicitly state their positions on issues and they follow through with those through the policymaking process. Today, and to us, this doesn't seem like a very surprising call for action, but back at the time, this was actually a very surprising and important claim, because in the 1950s, the 2 parties were so close together, voters were not able to differentiate the policies of different candidates. And in one of the most stated claims today, they actually called directly for more polarization in 1950. They said, an effective party system requires first that the parties are able to bring forth programs to which they commit themselves, and second, that the parties possess sufficient internal cohesion to carry out these programs. This is political science speak for saying we need more polarization in American legislatures. In 2007, then, a series of authors wrote a paper that was titled, "Be Careful What You Wish For." So the short of the story here is that polarization can, in some cases, be good. because it allows voters to differentiate the policy positions of different parties. But it seems quite clear, as the books I showed you before suggest, that the degree of polarization that we see today can be quite damaging to democracy. So at this point, before I get much farther, it's probably helpful to take a step back and to just define what polarization is. There are generally two definitions of polarization in American politics. The first is what I'm going to talk to you about today, and that is ideological polarization. In words, ideological polarization is the separation of policy preferences into distinct camps. As I described before, this is the Democrats voting with the Democrats and with liberal positions, and the Republicans increasingly taking positions on the right and conservative positions. So as I mentioned, this is what I'll focus on throughout the rest of my talk today. But there's also this second definition of polarization that's also really important, and I just wanted to flag. And that is what we call affective polarization, which is the tendency of partisans to feel warmer towards their in-group than towards the out-group, or even hostile to the out-group. So just to provide a quick example of what this affective polarization looks like, this figure plots one measure of affective polarization, which is the mean thermometer difference between how I rate the people in my in-party and how I rate people in the out-party. And I've plotted this, I was only able to get data back to 2008, but I've plotted this for 3 different relevant groups. This red line here shows the affective polarization rate for Democratic and Republican voters. So that is, how warmly on a scale of 0 to 100 do I rate the people in my party, and how warmly do I rate the people in the opposite party, where 100 is very warm and 0 is very cold. And what you see here is that initially there was about a 25% gap between the 25 percentage point gap between the two parties. And by 2008, that had risen to almost 35%. And my guess is that if we were able to extend this through 2025, this number would be above 50. And what we also see is that if we plot this same number but for race or for religion, that affective polarization has actually declined among these numbers to values that are actually quite close to 0. So this speaks to a broader trend in American politics in which partisanship is one of the most polarizing affective polarizations today, and that these other cleavages that we used to think about as some of the most important dividing parts of American politics have actually declined substantially. It's also important to note that while I'm going to focus on ideological polarization for the rest of the talk, affective polarization and ideological polarization may feed themselves in a circular process. When I think poorly about the other party, I may impute their policy positions to be extreme. When I think that they're extreme, it seems pretty likely that I'm going to think poorly of them affectively. So these are two very intricately related concepts, but for today I'm going to focus on ideological polarization. Okay, so in order to understand why American legislatures are polarized, we first need some measure of polarization. That is, how do I know that American legislatures are so polarized? So to answer that question, I'm going to take a very quick detour into the methodological processes that we go through as political scientists to measure polarization. And the relevant term here is that we conduct what's called ideal point estimation, which is the process of measuring candidates' ideal points in n-dimensional space. So to give you a sense of what this looks like, the goal is to be able to place candidates on, in this case, a one-dimensional line. That is, I want to be able to say, using data, that Nancy Pelosi is more liberal than Steny Hoyer, and that Marco Rubio in the Senate is slightly less conservative than Ted Cruz in the Senate. Now, of course, these distinctions make sense because we know all of these people. They're generally leaders in American legislatures today. But what do we do when instead of having 435 members in the House, we have something like 7,000 members of state legislatures? And I want to be able to make comparisons across states and across time. Well, political scientists have actually come up with many different ways to measure ideal points. A couple of different ways that I've seen used before are to use expert surveys, to ask voters the positions that they think candidates espouse, to use interest group ratings, to use the text content of candidates' websites, And what I'm going to focus on today is roll call voting. So a very unique and interesting feature of Congress and all of the American state legislatures I study is that the roll call records of all of the votes that are cast on the floor of these chambers are a public record. Every year in Congress, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 roll call votes are cast. And this roll call vote is a set of similarities between these legislators. So this is an example of what it might look like, where I have candidates on the rows here, or legislators, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and I have a series of different bills, Bill A all the way to Bill Z in this case. And we observe either a yay, that is a yes, or a nay, a no vote on each of these bills. Sometimes you will decide not to cast a vote. That's a strategic decision that causes a lot of problems downstream, but we'll just ignore for now. And the idea of this algorithm called DW Nominate is that it takes all of this matrix and these roll call votes, and it collapses it into that one dimension that I showed you earlier. So it's a dimension reduction technique that takes a full matrix and collapses it so that we're taking the dimension that explains the most amount of variation in that matrix and calls that the ideological dimension. There are as many ways as you could imagine, and then a couple, to actually perform this decomposition, and it's the subject of a lot of debate. In fact, I took an entire class on how to do this decomposition, so we're just going to focus on DW Nominate, but I assure you that these results are going to be very similar with other methods that we use as well. So once I do that, and I calculate the ideological positions of candidates using this roll call voting matrix, we get something that looks like this. This is a distribution across time of the ideological positions of candidates in Congress. So on the left in the top here is in the 90th Congress, this is a density plot of the ideological positions of Democrats in that Congress, and this is the Republicans on the right. And what you can see if you look at this is that the positions of the Democrats have moved increasingly towards the left. That is, Democrats have become more liberal, and Republicans have moved to the right. This is the ideological polarization that I'm motivated to study in this talk. And we can also do the same thing for American state legislatures. There are a number of interesting methodological quirks that we have to think about when studying state legislatures. Specifically, we have to think about how I compare roll call voting in, for example, Minnesota to roll call voting in Wisconsin. How do I make those two estimates comparable? In Congress, this is really easy because everybody is voting on the same bills. But in state legislatures, everybody's voting on very different bills, and this changes over time. So we'll use a series of legislator surveys to help bridge these legislative ideal points across time and across states. And when we do that, we actually see a very similar pattern as we saw in Congress. That is, Democrats are moving to the left, and Republicans are moving to the right. So the question then is, why are American legislatures so polarized? Why are these distributions increasingly moving to the extremes? And in the remainder of my time today, I'm going to talk to you about 4 papers that I've written along with co-authors that study and answer this question. So first, I'm going to show you that an important way to understand polarization in American legislatures is by thinking about the supply and demand of the candidates who run for office. That is, when I can only choose among polarized candidates, polarization in American legislatures is going to increase. And when voters reward moderate positions at lower rates, then polarization will increase as well. Then I'm going to show you a second set of results on local press coverage. We know that in the political science literature that press coverage is important for democratic accountability, and yet we see even today that local newspapers are closing at a surprisingly high rate. In this paper, I'll show you that the closure of local news resources results in moderate candidates performing worse in American legislative elections. Then third, I'm going to talk about donors and campaign finance. There are a lot of different ways you can imagine that donors affect polarization. We're going to think specifically today about one route that it affects polarization, which is that donors reward extreme candidates in elections, and that as a result, extremists do better in elections. As a preview, I'm going to show you in this third chunk that moderate candidates are actually favored in fundraising in American elections, contrary to many claims that you'll see in the media today.
And then finally, I'm going to talk very quickly about a series of papers on election administration. American legislatures are very unique in that the states have a lot of control over who runs, over how they administer American elections. And I'm going to show you one study that suggests that the partisan attempts to increase turnout among your party do not always succeed. Okay, so let's begin with this candidate supply and selection story. In order to understand why American legislatures are so polarized, probably the most intuitive place to start is by asking who runs for office. And the idea here is that the supply of candidates who run for office actually sets a floor on the degree of legislative polarization that we will observe in office. V.O. Keene actually captured this sentiment the best by saying that if the people can only choose among rascals, they are certain to choose a rascal. In other words, if only extremists are running for office, we shouldn't be surprised that the people that are representing us are extremists. And then second, in this section, I'm going to talk to you about the voter demand for extremist candidates. That is, conditional on the set of people who run for office, do voters elect the moderate candidate or the extremist candidate on average? It's through the combination of these two supply and demand factors that we can understand perhaps the most important way that American elections affect polarization. But first, I'm going to take one more quick methodological detour to tell you a little bit more about the careful work that we're doing to get this answer right. So let's return now to the roll call matrix that I reported to you before. So recall that before, I had rows for every incumbent in an American legislature, and I had their roll call voting on the columns in every bill that was cast in that American legislature. But if I want to study the candidate pool, that is the set of people for run for office, I'm not going to be able to capture those candidates' positions because they ultimately don't win elections. There's somebody like Amy McGrath or Mehmet Oz who run a campaign, who are important to study, but don't ever have an opportunity to cast roll call votes. So we need some way to fill in these question marks in the roll call voting matrix. So in this first paper, along with a colleague at Stanford and one at NYU, we introduce a new method to infer these question marks by using campaign contributions. So put simply, the idea here is that I'm going to infer candidates' positions in roll call voting records based on the campaign contributions that they receive. And this works because essentially everybody has to raise money to be competitive in an American election. And we typically think of donors as holding one set ideological position. That is, if I donate to Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer, we can infer that I'm likely a fairly left-wing donor. And that if I also then donate, in this case to Amy McGrath, that there is some similarity in my ideological preferences between these incumbents and this challenger who I do not have roll call voting records for. The same thing is then true of Mehmet Oz. We can look at, in this case, donors A and B here. So Mehmet Oz receives a lot of money from donor Z, and donor Z is also giving that money to Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz in this stylized example. And so when we do this with a matrix that has trillions of rows, we can actually infer what the positions of McGrath and Oz would be based on the campaign contributions that they receive. Now, there's a lot of methodological difficulties involved in this that I'm going to step aside here, but just to give you a sense of some of the things that we're thinking about in this process, is that the set of people who run are going to change for every election, and that if you lose, you're very unlikely to run in a future election. So in state legislatures, only about 10% of people run again after losing in their first election. And this means that an incumbent, like Nancy Pelosi, has received campaign contributions for 30 years or more. Mehmet Oz or Amy McGrath only received campaign contributions in one election. And so you can think about ways as the polarization space changes that this might bias our estimates of candidates' ideological positions. There are a lot of different ways you could think about getting around this, but just for this paper, we're going to focus only on the campaign contributions you receive in your first primary election before you're elected to office. This helps us make sure that we're studying the same roughly amount of money for each candidate, and that we don't have this post-treatment bias in political science terms where after you win, potentially your campaign contributions change, and as a result, we're biasing your estimates of ideological positions. Now, if that seems a little bit too much, don't worry. I can assure you that what we've done is, at least in the general realm of correct, by comparing these inferred candidate positions to how they actually vote in office. So on the x-axis here, or the horizontal axis, I've plotted these candidates' inferred roll call voting records. That is, I've filled in the question marks in this matrix. And on the y-axis, I plot their observed record, the actual yays and nays, for the candidates that I have actual roll call voting records for. And what this plot generally shows is that there's a very strong correlation between this inferred measure and your observed record in office. In layman's terms, we're doing a good job predicting how you would vote in American legislatures. You should be comforted by this because it suggests that what I'm going to show you down the line actually reflects candidates' inferred roll call voting records and not just random noise in a fundraising meeting. Okay, so with this measure of candidate ideology, we can return now and answer these two questions. That is, how does the supply of candidates shape polarization? And how does voter demand affect the election outcomes? In these results today, I'm just going to focus on state legislatures because this is what I focused much of my dissertation on. But in future work, I'm looking on extending this out to Congress and to gubernatorial elections. This figure then plots the average polarization in the candidate pool across time. This is a very simple measure that we've used. We're just calculating polarization as the difference in the median positions for Democratic and Republican candidates over time. That is essentially, how far is the average Democrat from the average Republican of all of the candidates who run for state legislative office? That is, not just the incumbents, but also the people who run but lose. And what you see when you look at this figure is that across time, incumbents have become more polarized. This is something that we already know because we can study roll call voting records for a very long time. But what's new here is that these non-incumbents, the candidates who ultimately do not win office, are becoming as polarized at the same rate. So in other words, even if we chose the most moderate candidates in the election, we would still be choosing among extremists, or in V.O. Keene's words, rascals. Then there's this second question about, conditional on the set of people who run for office, how do voters reward moderates or extremists? The answer, it turns out, is very complicated. If you ask the New York Times editorial board, they'll say something like this: the partisans are wrong, moving to the center is the way to win. And then if you look back 2 days later, you'll find a prominent critic of the New York Times saying essentially that the New York Times is wrong and that the electoral value of moderation is essentially zero. So why is this such a difficult question to answer? To try to explain this to you, I'm going to use what we call a flowchart, or in economics, a DAG, a directed acyclical graph. Because it's economics, we have to make everything sound very fancy. But the idea here is that we want to study the relationship between candidates' ideology and candidate vote share. But you can think of all of these other confounders that might affect both candidate ideology and vote share. So a couple of the most prominent confounders could be district partisanship or national election tides. That is, it is very likely that in districts where the moderate candidate does well, we're also going to see a moderate candidate running for office because they're more likely to win. And the challenge is that we need to be able to separate out all of these strategic confounders from the actual relationship that we're trying to study. One solution is to just measure every possible thing that could be in this bottom bucket and include it in some statistical analysis in a way that allows us to hold it constant. The trouble is, the second that I do that, somebody at the New York Times editorial board or Strength in Numbers is going to say, you forgot to control for this variable. And we'll just continue going down this pathway forever until we've exhausted our ability to estimate this relationship. So instead, in this paper, I'm going to use a quasi-experimental research design called the regression discontinuity design. It sounds really fancy, but the idea is very elegant and simple. The idea here is that randomization is a social scientist's best friend. When I randomize treatment, I know that everything except for that treatment itself is going to be balanced. So that is district partisanship, the wealth of the district, those are all balanced in my data set. So the idea of this discontinuity design is that I'm going to find the sliver of randomness that exists in American elections as a result of the first past the post setup. That is, if I barely win an election, that's going to change my treatment status relative to if I barely lose an election on the other side of this dashed line, and that candidates don't have precise control over whether they win or lose an election. That is, I know that it's going to be a close election, and so I'm going to be going out full, even if it's a 5% point margin or a 2% point margin. So visually what this is going to look like is that on the left-hand side of this dashed line, we're going to focus on primary elections in which the more moderate candidate of the two won that primary. That means the moderate candidate won, and they go on to run for that party in the general election. And then on the right-hand side of this line, the more extreme candidate wins their party's primary and goes on to represent that party in the general election. This figure then plots the candidates' party's vote share in the general election after we run that randomized experiment. You look at these results, you can see that in the case in which the moderate candidate wins, they seem to be doing quite well. And then at the point at which we switch to nominating an extremist candidate, their party's vote share declines significantly. It goes down by about 5 percentage points. And so what we say in econometrics terminology is that at the limit, at this actual dashed line, we have randomization on whether the moderate or extremist candidate won that's independent of all these other confounders, and we can actually isolate the causal effect of whether the moderate or extremist won that election. So what these results tell us is that general election voters actually punish extremist candidates in the general election rather than reward moderates. But if we actually do this analysis over time, we find that this preference for moderate candidates has declined substantially. In 2000, the advantage was about 3 percentage points, and today in 2020, it's fallen to about 1 percentage point. In words, voters are rewarding moderate candidates at lower rates today. So that's the first set of explanations that I'm going to talk to you today about polarization. That is, the set of candidates who run are extreme, and voters are rewarding moderate candidates at lower rates today. But a very natural question that comes from that is, why do voters reward moderate candidates at lower rates today? One of the most prominent explanations is the decline of local media coverage. We typically think of voters, when they receive less news coverage, as being less able to hold their representative accountable and to be unable to differentiate between moderate and extremist candidates. And on the legislator side, when legislators receive less press coverage, they may have weaker incentives to work for their constituency, to provide accountable representation, and that they may face limited electoral penalties for acting out of step with their district. These concerns are all the more important today because we've seen a massive decline in local media coverage over the past 2 decades. This figure shows that since 2004, more than 2,100 local daily and weekly newspapers have closed their doors. And this was actually taken, I think, in 2000, so 2020. So even more have closed since then. And the result of this is that many parts of the United States are what we call news deserts. That is, areas in which one or no local newspapers serve that county. This figure shows that as of 2000, almost half of these counties have only one newspaper, which is usually a weekly. This raises a really important question that hasn't been answered before, and that is, how does this down-ballot media coverage affect state legislatures, and what happens as this media coverage changes over time? And of course, in econometrics world, I can show you that this is going to be difficult because press coverage, so this is the relationship that we're trying to study, press coverage affecting legislative behavior. But in terms of this DAG, we can think again about all these other confounding variables. That is, variables that affect both press coverage and legislator behavior. So a couple you might think of are demand for news coverage, education, or district wealth. Just to walk through one of these, this demand for news, we imagine that in districts that are more where the legislator is providing good representation, perhaps there's a higher demand for news, and this affects both legislator behavior and the press coverage that that legislator ultimately receives. So we need some way to differentiate out all of these confounding variables. So to answer this question, I'm going to actually take inspiration from River Falls, Pierce County, and St. Which is that newspaper markets, where newspapers circulate, and legislative districts, the set of boundaries that we use to determine representation, are actually not overlapping in really any meaningful way. That is, there's this haphazard overlap between legislative districts and newspaper markets, and this makes sense because newspapers were founded, in the 1800s, 1900s, long before we had set out these districts. Districts up until 1960 essentially were defined at the county level for many state legislatures. So I can take advantage of this as if random variation in how much my district overlaps with your newspaper market to generate this measure of overlap or press coverage that's going to moderate the amount of press coverage that a state legislator receives. So very technically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the market share of a newspaper and I'm going to multiply it by the reader's share of that newspaper in that district. And it's going to give me this measure called congruence, which runs from about 0 to essentially 1, where low values is going to represent poor news coverage, and 1 is going to represent very high news coverage. If this all seems really abstract, we could think about River Falls for a moment. So this is the 10th district up here in 2016 before redistricting, is where many of us live. Many people in the 10th Senate district in Wisconsin receive their media coverage from Minnesota, from the Minnesota Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press. And because the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune circulate primarily in Minnesota, that means that those newspapers are going to focus on Minnesotan politics, not Wisconsin politics. But if we go right down here to the 31st Senate District, most of the people in this district are actually getting their news coverage from the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram, which circulates primarily in Wisconsin and around this area. And it means that the press coverage that these 31st District residents are going to receive is going to focus much more on their representative. The same story plays out in southern Wisconsin. If we compare people in Milwaukee, who are receiving much of their news coverage from Chicago, to people in Madison, who are receiving much more localized news coverage from the Capitol Report. In large samples, then, we can think about how this design gives us variation even between adjoining districts and the amount of press coverage that your district receives. I can then use this measure of press coverage to study the relationship of press coverage or the causal chain across elections. So in the paper, I study how this congruence measure affects press coverage, and then how press coverage shapes the behavior of voters, how then voters shape elections, and ultimately, how this election effect shapes the representation that politicians present. For the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on these last two chunks very quickly. First, I'll look at voters and elections. To do so, I'm going to use a different regression design. For the sake of time, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The idea here is that I'm going to run a new regression called a midpoint regression, which is essentially a dimension reduction technique like I described before, but it's going to allow me to place candidates and districts on the same scale without making any assumptions about where they are relative to each other. The idea is that I'm going to fix the distance between these two candidates, the Democratic and Republican candidate, and I'm going to moderate the midpoint so that as this midpoint moves, the Democratic candidates become more moderate and the Republican candidate is going to become more extreme. This looks like a very confusing table, and I don't have a better way to report the results, unfortunately, but I'll just describe to you what this means. It tells us, this midpoint coefficient, that as that midpoint moves to the right, that is, as the Democratic candidate becomes more moderate and the Republican becomes more extreme, the Democratic candidate does better. This makes sense. But this interaction term is what we call this here, tells us that this midpoint effect is actually significantly larger when your congruence is higher. That is, when you have more press coverage in your district as a result of this historical mismatch, you're going to do better when you're a moderate candidate. And you can actually compare these effect sizes, and you see that in places where press coverage is strongest, this electoral return to moderation is about double the size of where it is when press coverage is weakest. And then lastly, we can study the relationship between elections and the set of politicians that are elected and how they represent your district. And to do this, I'm going to run a similar set of analyses, but now the outcome is going to be either the percent of floor votes that you miss as a legislator, the number of bills that you sponsor, or the probability that you're on a power committee. These are all relatively easy ways to measure whether your legislator is providing you good representation. And in words, what this figure tells us is that when you as a legislator receive more press coverage, you're going to miss fewer floor votes. That is, you're going to be in the legislature and cast more votes. You're going to sponsor more bills, and you're more likely to serve on important committees such as rules and appropriations. In short, when a legislator receives more press coverage, they work more for their constituency. Okay, so I've talked so far about the supply of candidates, and I've talked about the media coverage that these candidates receive. The last institutional paper I'm going to talk to you about today is donors and campaign finance. It's hard to open up the New York Times or the Washington Post these days without reading some op-ed about how donors are increasing polarization. Somebody in the Washington Post recently wrote that the growing participation of ideologically oriented donors appears to have exacerbated legislative polarization. And you'll see a similar commentary from someone in the New York Times. The first question that we might want to ask ourselves is, does it matter if donors reward and favor moderate or extremist candidates at all? And to answer that question, we can draw on the political science literature, and I can describe to you 4 ways in which money may matter in American politics. The first, and probably the most obvious, is that campaign fundraising can fund ads, campaign staff, and get out the vote efforts. If I have more money, I'm more able to run these ads, and it might increase my vote share. A second is that more money generates media coverage. Raising money is somewhat of a rat race, and when a candidate raises more money than they expect, then they receive more press coverage. This is very valuable for a candidate. The opposite is also true. When candidates receive very little money or less than expected, they're more likely to drop out of that race. And then, of course, the one that the consultants love is that it takes money to make money. And so candidates consistently need to make money in order to show that they are viable candidates. Of course, there's an interesting question here about why do I care about donors separately from voters? Aren't donors also voters? The answer is not necessarily. There are many groups of entities in American politics that can contribute to campaigns, but are not actually voters, including corporations, special interest groups, labor unions. And actually, the vast majority of voters do not ever make a political contribution in American politics. Only about 15% of voters report ever making a political contribution. So it's not immediately clear that these analyses I just showed you for voters correlate to donors. In this third paper, I'm going to now transition to studying both the US House and Senate and both the upper and lower chambers of American state legislatures. I'm going to go through this set of results quickly so that we don't go too long, but I'm going to run a very similar analysis to the vote analysis that I showed you earlier, except now the outcome is the party's share of general election fundraising. Again, on the left-hand side of this regression discontinuity design, the moderate candidate is going to win their party's primary and run in the general. And to the right, the extremist candidate is going to win and run in that general election. These black dots then show the bin-to average of parties' general election fundraising share across this running variable, or the x-axis. The way to interpret this is that when a party narrowly switches from nominating their moderate candidate in the primary to the extremist candidate, their share of general election fundraising declines by between 6 and 7 percentage points. But this actually cuts against the story that I showed you earlier from the Washington Post, that donors are advantaging extremist candidates in elections. And what's interesting is we can also do a series of what we call heterogeneity analyses. I can break down this aggregate estimate by the types of donors that are making these contributions. These figures will then show the point estimate, that the size of the gap in this discontinuity for different groups of donors. So for all contributions, I estimate about a 7 percentage point penalty. If I focus on individual donors, this penalty is slightly smaller. It's about 5 percentage points. But I find that corporations punish extremist nominees at about 13 percentage points. That is nearly 3 times the rate of individual donors. So these results paint a picture of general election donors as a marked, yet waning, moderating filter in American elections. Of course, it's not the only way that campaign finance can affect polarization. You can also imagine a world in which donors incentivize candidates to take extreme positions, not in elections, and that if donors become more extreme globally, candidates will run and follow that extremism. But this paper speaks to this third type of explanation of campaign resources. It says that donors punish extremist candidates in general elections. And then lastly, I want to talk about a series of papers about ballot access and election administration in American legislatures. One of the most unique features of American democracy and election administration is that election administration is highly decentralized across the country. Every state, and in the case of Wisconsin, many municipalities, have the sole authority to determine policy on voter ID requirements, drop-off ballots, how many boxes you can have, whether you have access to early voting, access to no-excuse absentee voting, and you can even have laws related to whether you can give food to individuals waiting in line to vote. And of course, this series of different policies and patchwork of legal requirements has generated a series of claims that partisans are using these policies to advantage one party over the other. This is a very empirical claim and something that we can evaluate. Do they actually succeed in this effort? To answer that question, I'm going to focus today on one of the most prominent examples of these debates, which is that no-excuse absentee voting helped the Democrats in 2020. So remember that in 2020, it was the COVID-19 pandemic, and there was a large push among many states to increase vote-by-mail access. That is, instead of going and turning up to the polls to cast a vote, you turn up, you file paperwork, and the state will send you a ballot that you can then return to your election administrator via mail. And it was very in vogue at the time to believe that this actually advantaged the Democrats. So you can see that these authors at The Guardian said that the Democrats took a risk to push mail-in voting and that it paid off for them. And Donald Trump agreed. He said that if you ever agreed to no-excuse absentee voting, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. And at face value, a couple of facts may actually make you think that this describes the world and the effects of no-excuse absentee voting. One fact of the 2020 election is that turnout was much higher than it was in prior elections. It was something like 68% turnout in 2020, while in 2016 it was closer to 61. And in 2024, I think it was 65%. At the same time, fact 2 here, the rates of voting by mail were particularly high, primarily among Democrats, but also among Republican voters. And then lastly, in 2020, the Democrats won the presidency and the Senate, and they held the House. But critically, these facts do not imply that vote by mail boosted Democrat turnout. And the reason this is an old maxim that you might have heard in your statistics classes. That is, correlation does not imply causation. There were many things that were going on in American elections and legislatures during the 2020 election, and it's possible that they just happened at the same time that the Democratic candidates did well in the 2020 election. Maybe if we reran the world in some weird way and we didn't have vote-by-mail access, the Democrats still would have performed better. How do we differentiate between these two worlds? In this last paper I'm going to talk to you about, we take 2 different strategies. The first is what we call a panel analysis of turnout. That is, I'm going to trace the turnout rate of states across time for states that switched to absentee voting in 2020, and for states that had no absentee voting available in the 2020 election. So down here, I've listed the states that actually implemented no excuse voting in the 2020 election. You see that there's a great deal of variety in the political leanings of these states. But what this figure shows us is that if we look in the last 3 to 4 election cycles, in states that switched to absentee voting in 2020, the Democratic candidates are not trending in a different direction than in states that did not have access to no excuse absentee voting. So this suggests, although it's not smoking gun evidence, that the introduction of this no excuse absentee voting policy did not substantially advantage Democratic candidates. But if you're a statistics person in the room, you might complain and say that, how do I know that these districts that these states are adopting this policy without reference to the turnout in an election? Maybe these states realized that Democrats were going to do well and they wanted to improve the Democrats' chance, so they implemented these policies. And all the states that didn't implement no excuse absentee voting did not do so because they wanted to disadvantage the Democrats. Well, the answer is that we can take advantage of this regression discontinuity design that I've introduced to you twice now. Except in this case, I'm going to look at a natural experiment that happens in Texas in every election. In Texas, in order to cast a vote no excuse, you have to be greater than 64 years old. So the second that you turn 65, you're eligible to cast that vote. But if you're 64 years, 364 days, you do not have eligibility to cast this vote absentee. And this is a pretty easy policy to enforce, right? Because you can't change your birthday, and we have administrative records of everybody's dates of birth. So in this figure, I actually plot the turnout rates among 64-year-olds and 65-year-olds and the cohorts on the other sides of them as well. So just on this side, to be clear, these people do not have access to no excuse voting in Texas. And the people on the right-hand side of this dashed line do have access to it because they've attained 65 years. The outcome in this case is the share of ballots that were cast absentee relative to the entire population of eligible voters in that bin. And what we see is, among 64-year-olds, very few, less than 10%, are casting votes absentee in the 2020 election, or in the 2016 or 2012 elections for that matter. But when we look after 65, for these people that are eligible to cast with a no excuse rate, we see that this number has actually skyrocketed to about 18% of eligible voters. So this tells a story in which voters, not Democrats, voters are turning out at higher rates when they have access to no excuse voting. But this doesn't actually imply anything about the actual turnout rate. If we look at the share of people that turn out overall, that is people who then go and turn out at the ballot box, who actually go and cast physical ballots, we see that the turnout rate and shifting to 65 does not have any differential impact on aggregate turnout. And the way that you can see that is you want to look at the 64 and 65-year-old cutoff. You see that right around 64 and 65, the turnout is essentially identical to the turnout rate among voters in the 65-year-old. And that this actually holds for 2020, but also holds for 2016 and for 2012. So, bigger picture here, what motivates voters and why are these results important? First of all, this paper and a series of other papers that I've written on similar topics suggests that it's voter interest rather than the convenience of casting a ballot that drives turnout. That is, if I make it easier to cast a vote, we should not be surprised that voters do not increase their turnout rates much. Because if I'm going to cast a vote, I'm going to cast a vote no matter if it's this costly or 5+ that costly. We should also then, as a result of this paper and a series of other papers in political science, be skeptical of claims that election reforms that are purported to have partisan effects are going to actually bias the representation that we receive. The reality is that many of these election reforms, including no excuse absentee voting, but also voter ID, and other policies, actually target a very small portion of the population, and as a result, and they have small effects. As a result, the combination of those two small variables also equals something small. And then even if these are intended to have partisan effects, these election administration policies do not in reality oftentimes have those effects. This is of course not to say that convenience voting does not have many important normative reasons to cast votes. We could probably think as a society that reducing the barriers to casting votes and making it more equitable to access the ballot box is an important goal. But what this paper and some of my other research suggests is that decreasing the cost of voting is not going to significantly change election outcomes or the set of people who run for office and win. That's an overview of the 4 papers on polarization. I want to talk a little bit to conclude about what these papers tell us about what we might do to reduce polarization. The first, and probably the most important, is that to reduce polarization, it is important to recruit candidates to run at all levels of government who represent the positions that you want in office. It is particularly important to do so in down-ballot legislatures. Fully 50% of members of Congress were first state legislators. And many state legislators were school board members, were city councilors, or mayors. So it begins with these down-ballot elections and getting representative people in office at these down-ballot elections that will then ultimately trickle up and affect the representation that we receive in Congress. A second is that media coverage is critical for the functioning of American democracy. Supporting local news media is important because, as my paper has suggested, it will help moderate candidates perform better, and it results in voters having more information to evaluate their representative's performance. And lastly, it's important to be skeptical of claims about ballot access. It's very easy to turn, as I mentioned in the introduction, to the Washington Post or the New York Times and to see claims, or the Guardian, about specific election administration policies affecting election outcomes. In reality, it is much more complex background, and that correlation is not causation. It's in this paper and in a series of other papers, I've shown that moderate candidates are going to perform better when news coverage is stronger, and in this bullet point 3, that we should be skeptical of these claims that ballot access advantage any particular party. Very quickly then, this is a series of papers that form my dissertation, a little bit more about what I'm going to do in the future. I'm working on a series of projects on voter registration and election administration, so answering a series of questions about, do election administrators exhibit bias in who they purge from voter registration rolls? I'm answering a series of questions about redistricting, that is, how do legislators adapt when their legislative districts change? It seems especially important right now with all the uncertainty about boundaries that representatives are supposed to represent. I'm working on a series of questions about the incumbency advantage, especially in the primary election, about liquid democracy, which is, would citizen legislators, that is, electing people in this room instead of somebody that is on the ballot now, actually provide better representation than we receive today? And then, of course, I'm working on a series of econometrics questions about accounting for strategic donating and censoring bias that I mentioned earlier when estimating these candidate positions. That's everything that I have planned. I'd love to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, and thank you for coming. Alan.
Have you done any work on the partisan primaries and the role of the partisan primaries in polarization? So in other words, those moderate candidates have to get through a very partisan primary to get to the general election. Our preference is for more moderate candidates, is what I'm hearing, but they've got to get through these partisan primaries first.
Yes, that's right. And this gets back to this claim about election administration, which is that the states control a great deal of what happens in American elections. And there are many degrees of what a primary looks like. You're mentioning closed primary type setups where I can only cast a vote in my primary election if I'm affiliated with that party. There are also cases where I can cast a vote for either party, regardless of whether I'm registered with that party. And one of the most popular claims in political science is that these closed primaries are increasing polarization. The idea is that I'm only going to get a small set of people that are voting in this primary are ideologically extreme. They're going to select extreme candidates in the primary, and then I'm only going to have extremists to choose from in the general. And the cool thing about American democracy is that we have 50 states, and so there's variation between each state and how this happens. And so we can actually study what happens using what's called a difference in differences design. That is, I compare how extreme the candidate pool is in a state before and after they implement this policy, and I make that comparison also to states that have had that policy over time. What you find when you do this actually is that there's no effect of these blanket or partisan primaries on polarization. This is, I think, somewhat surprising. It seems like these policies have a large effect on the people who turn out, but there's no evidence in the literature, and I've actually replicated this study for a paper, that partisan primaries are increasing polarization in this way.
Just a couple of thoughts. Thanks so much. This is really very, very interesting. A couple things. I'm wondering, is there an optimal level of polarization? If in the 50s we didn't have enough polarization to be able to differentiate candidates, and now we maybe have too much, is there an optimal level? And has anybody, or are you looking into the impact that ranked choice voting could have on polarization?
Right. They're good, all good questions. So you might have seen that in the last couple of days, the Democratic Party is considering implementing ranked RCV for the primary election. This has also been very prominent because Minneapolis and St. Paul also have ranked choice voting. One candidate lost in St. Paul as a result of ranked choice voting, but likely wouldn't have without RCV. It's very difficult to study this right now because we don't have a lot of state legislatures that have implemented this. Alaska and Maine are the only two states that have this policy right now. But what you should be looking for is, and what we should be looking at in the future in these city races, is whether the implementation of RCV affects the ideology of these candidates that come out of the process. Do we actually observe when we implement RCV that moderate candidates are winning at higher rates, or that when we run these surveys that voters feel as if they are being represented better among RCV winners than not? As regards to the optimal level of polarization, it's very hard to say. It seems likely that the optimal level of polarization is somewhere in between what it was in the 1950s when they were asking for more and what it is today where we're asking for much less. Where that actual number is, I can't say.
Okay, thanks for being here. Weren't a lot of the 2020 elections influenced a lot by the COVID situation and may have biased or skewed the results? And then you said, I think you said something about issues weren't as important as they seemed to be. We had an election, 2 years ago for Supreme Court Justice, and there was a big issue there, and we had a lot of publicity, and I think it really made a big difference.
Right, so first on this question about COVID, there are many ways that you could think that the pandemic affected the election outcome. It could be that it changed voters' positions and preferences about policies, that voters saw that what was happening in 2016 and the Trump administration's response to COVID was undesirable in some way, and that actually changed the positions of voters. But you can also think about these mechanical ways in which it might have affected the election, which is through these election administration policies. And that's what I've tried to show in this series of papers where we study the turnout rate and whether the policies that were implemented to run elections in response to the pandemic actually affected election outcomes. And what this paper shows, and what a series of other papers from other scholars have shown as well, is that these policies actually did not change the election outcomes themselves.
Would what you've just presented today be considered to be a template for managing an election, vetting candidates, establishing who maybe should become a candidate? Where do you go with this?
Right. So I see the purpose of this study to inform policymakers and parties on the facts of how the world functions and exists. It's important as a researcher to not get involved in the actual policy decisions themselves and to say you should do this policy with these results, because otherwise then we start to worry that the results of the research themselves will not be. What I can say though is that if your goal is to reduce polarization, that is a goal that you want. You want to find this balance between 1950 and 2022. That increasing the representativeness of the people that run for office, that increasing local press coverage are two of the most effective ways to do so.
You talked about media coverage and you talked about newspapers. I think the effect of course, the internet and social media and whatnot, which has, of course, increased in the last 10, 20 years, is so much more important. I think supporting local newspapers is probably a losing proposition. I remember hearing that Marjorie Taylor Greene was one of the most well-known members of Congress, not because she was so smart or anything else, but because she was so outrageous. And she got a lot of social media as well as other coverage. So the impact of the social media and internet seems to me as a huge factor that I haven't seen addressed, but maybe you did.
Yes, that's right. We can think about social media as affecting elections and our political climate in many ways. I feel like I've been saying this many times, but it's very difficult to study and actually estimate whether this is just correlation or causation. Is there something else that was happening at the same time that caused American legislatures to become more polarized that was not media coverage? An interesting way to study this that's incredibly expensive is to run a series of surveys in which you actually restrict people's access to social media and to the news. And a series of researchers at Stanford have actually done this, where they've recruited a set of participants and they've said, you cannot use Facebook, Instagram, or other social media for X number of days. And I'm going to ask you about how effectively polarized you are, about whether you're going to vote for an extreme candidate. And I'm going to compare that to a control group that continues to use press coverage, and receive this press coverage, this social media coverage. And they actually find no effect whatsoever of media coverage. Now, you could quibble with the results. You could say that they weren't treating the right types of social media, that maybe I should be restricting access to MSNBC and to Fox News or some other type of media. But that result, which has a series of very good data, suggests that it's not social media coverage that's causing this.
The minimal amount of the individual versus the corporation, that we're being represented by who we elect because they're, well, with the size of the contributions they're getting, are they partying more to the contributor or to the voter? What did you find?
Right. This is one of the longest running debates in American politics, which is, do donors skew representation in a way that would not if we did not have donors? There's a very famous book called Affluent Influence by Marty Gilens, who leverages a series of surveys across time and shows that over time, wealthy donors, the policy matches the preferences of wealthy donors much better than the broad American electorate, that this has become even worse in recent decades. So if you believe that the donors are part of the problem, Marty's book says a lot about polarization. It's also possible, as I've described in a couple of other instances, that this is just a case in which two trends are happening at the same time, and that perhaps something else is causing polarization other than these affluent donors. I can't actually say anything about that in this paper because the outcome is not the preferences of candidates and the representation that those candidates provide. But there are also another series of papers that actually ask voters about this using survey data, and they tend to find something fairly similar, which is that the preferences of wealthy voters, wealthy donors, are represented better than the preferences of the general. Ooh.
What about the effect of lobbyists versus constituents?
We're hitting all of the top literatures in American politics. This is great. One of the surprising things for an early scholar of American politics, such as myself, is that actually there is very little money in American politics. There's a very famous paper that's titled that in 2001 called "Why Is There So Little Money in American Politics?" They say that if it was the case that donors were buying influence in election outcomes, we would observe 50, 100 times more money in American politics than we actually do today. The actual amount of campaign contributions, I know you're asking about lobbying, but this is important. The actual amount of money spent in a congressional campaign in 2024 is only about $3 million. That is direct campaign, $3 billion. Direct campaign contributions made to a candidate committee. There's much more spent on independent expenditures, but it's nothing on the order of the amount of money the federal government spends. And if we actually think that this money is buying services from the government, why is there not more money? The fact of the matter is that there's actually about 10 times more money in lobbying as there is in direct campaign contributions. So somewhere on the order of $25, $30 billion. But still, when you think about the size of the federal government's budget, $20 trillion, it's a drop in the bucket. And so most of the answers of political scientists have been that in campaign contributions and lobbying, you give a little and you get a little. It's not that I can show up as a lobbyist and I can directly ask for a policy that's going to give my company $50 billion, but that I might be able, on the margin, to provide some useful information that maybe in the long term might do my company a little well. But the fact that we don't see so much money in American politics suggests, at least first order, that it's not campaign contributions that are causing this huge distortions in the policies that we actually see in the real world.
Another question.
In some of your earlier slides, you showed data that showed increasing polarization or political affiliation and decrease in affiliation with ethnicity or identity with ethnicity and religion.
Yes.
Would you say that, is there any truth to the idea that maybe we're just looking for a better way to belong and that's the only thing that seems to be available right now?
For a better way to what?
For personally, for people to belong, to be part of a group. So we're part of a political group as a way to shape our identity and who we are and who we belong to.
This is Robert Putnam's argument in Bowling Alone, that American society has become so fragmented that there is no place, the church as an institution is not a place for you to feel like you belong. And so potentially, as a result, these other types of relationships, like Democratic and Republican, matter more than other things that we might want them normatively as a society to mean. I think that certainly could be part of what's going on. There are a series of books that dig into this explanation even more. So Ezra Klein has a great book called Why We're So. It begins to dig into this explanation to some extent. This is not the centerpiece of my research, but that's the book that I would suggest reading. Yes?
For presidential.
You never know. I'll be
31% of eligible voters in America voted for Kamala Harris, and 32% of them voted for Donald Trump, and 37% of them chose not to vote. Is there any academic indication that mandatory voting, like some countries have, would contribute to polarization or would decrease polarization?
Oh, great. Okay, that's not where I thought you were going with that. That's a really interesting question. Yes, that's right. So in Australia, I think you receive a $50 fine if you do not cast a vote in the national elections. I think the political science version of this question would be, what is the partisanship of the marginal voter? Of this 37%, if we force them to cast a ballot, would Donald Trump be in office right now or would he come? It's difficult to ask and to answer that question, obviously, but what we can do is we can look at voter registrations. So I have a series of papers doing this where I can look at the partisanship that you sign up for when you sign up to become an eligible voter. And if you assume that Democrats are voting for Harris and Republicans are voting for Trump, the New York Times actually has a great analysis that shows that Donald Trump would have still won the election if that was the case. Of course, who I sign up to vote for and who my partisan registration is associated with does not tie me to voting for one candidate. So just a couple of weeks ago, actually, G. Elliott Morris ran a survey on this and asked who would you vote for to these people that actually did not vote in the election. And they found that Donald Trump still would have won by about 4%. So what this means for polarization and a mandatory voting record, I think it's very difficult to say. But if we think that these voters, these non-voters, are less polarized, and generally they're less politically engaged, then we might actually see more moderate candidates winning elections at higher rates. But in that case, it's more of a story of we're shooting in the dark and we're getting lucky almost that we're getting moderate candidates, not that there's this actual preference for moderate candidates in the electorate. That's a really interesting. Yes, please.
Thank you, Stacy. I don't know if I'm confused here or what, but all of the things that you taught me tonight are history. What does this portend for the future?
That's right. Part of that is intentional, is that in order to understand what's happening in the future in American politics, we need to understand the forces that have existed in the past, and that the best way to understand the future is by the patterns that have happened in the past. And we can say that with high probability, when we see in the future these claims about partisan policies affecting election outcomes, that based on what's happened in the past, it will not affect election outcomes. Or that based on what's happened in the past, the decline of moderate candidates running for office will increase participation. But predicting what happens in the future is a very difficult task. It's as difficult as it is predicting the weather, and even running polls today is a very fraught, difficult task. And to be honest, it's something that I think academics in general have difficulty with, because they are trying to present this very neutral position on the research that they're doing. But it's also difficult to find avenues to present your research in a way that's not just packaged up for a paper that 100 people are going to. But I hope in the future, and this is one step towards doing that, that the work that I do and the work that my discipline does will be accessible to people in the future and help shape what happens in life. Ellen.
This is aggregated, right? So this is national data.
Yes.
So if you were to repeat all of these regionally and how you broke this down regionally, do you think that you might find that some regions skew this and that we can draw some very broad assumptions about this? Ultimately, does it apply here in River Falls? Would it apply in Texas? Would it apply in individual states if you broke it down regionally?
Yes. So this is actually a big part of the paper that I just didn't have time to present today, but we can break this down regionally. We find generally that these patterns hold across the United States. One of the most important moderating variables we look at is not geographic region, but the professionalization of the legislature region. So American legislatures are interesting in many ways, but one of the most interesting is that the degree of professionalization varies a lot. In New Hampshire, in the state legislature, in the House, there are 400 members, and each member only receives a $100 salary every year. In California, there are 100-something members of the House, and their salary is $128,000 a year. And they are obviously in session in California much more often than they are in New Hampshire. And this creates this massive variation in how important being a legislator is and how important the legislation that legislative branch creates. For what it's worth, Wisconsin is actually a highly professionalized legislature, probably number 3 or 4 next to California and New York. So we could study and break down these results by the professionalization of the legislature. We actually find that this reward to moderate candidates is stronger in these more professionalized legislatures, that this penalty to extremist nominees in terms of fundraising is greater in these more professionalized legislatures. And that if you think about this, this actually does make a little bit of sense. What it's saying is that when the election outcomes are more important, when they're more likely to affect the representation that you receive, that I'm going to be more likely to express my true preferences and elect these moderate candidates. That's, of course, only one dimension of regional heterogeneity. There's many other things that you can do. And we do that in the back half of the paper, so I invite you to look at that. Great. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. It sounds like we have an interesting night of weather ahead, but I appreciate you making the trek out and looking forward to chatting you on the way out. Thank you.